Good morning. I'd like to call to order this morning's meeting of the Surface Transportation Board. The board is meeting this morning to discuss the comprehensive study of competition and related issues in the freight rail industry recently completed by Christensen Associates and released to the public this past Monday on schedule, the first working day of the month of November when we said the study would be out. The study is available for downloading from the board's website. Christensen carried out its study under a contract the board awarded in September of 2007 following a competitive procurement process. We engaged Christensen to undertake a comprehensive analysis of a wide range of issues, including competition and capacity in the freight rail industry and the interplay between the two. The board commissioned this study because of the important role that competitive considerations play in much of the board's work. Indeed, effective competition is a recurring theme in the National Rail Transportation Policy, the set of principles enacted by Congress that guide the board's regulation of the rail industry. For example, that policy provides in part that in regulating the railroad industry, it is the policy of the United States government to ensure the development and continuation of a sound rail transportation system with effective competition among rail carriers and with other modes. The Rail Transportation Policy, or RTP, also includes allowing to the maximum extent possible competition and the demand for services to establish reasonable rates for transportation by rail and avoiding undue concentrations of market power. Every day, competitive forces are at work in the freight rail industry as railroads compete against other railroads and other transportation modes, such as truck and barge, for customers' business. Indeed, the rail shipment of certain types of commodities, including, for example, all commodities shipped via intermodal traffic, the fastest growing category in recent years, is exempt from our rate regulation because of the effective competition available to shippers of those commodities. Moreover, rail traffic that moves at common carrier rates producing revenues that are less than 180% of the variable cost of the move are presumed by law to be subject to competitive forces. A substantial percentage of freight rail movements fall into one of these categories. This, of course, is not to say that all rail customers enjoy competitive options. Far from it. Many rail shippers do not have effective access to more than one rail carrier or to other modes of transportation. Indeed, in October 2006, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, expressed concerns over competition and shipper captivity in the rail industry. The GAO recommended that the board conduct a rigorous analysis of competition in the industry and consider actions to address problems associated with abuses of market power. So it is altogether fitting that the board chose to engage Christensen to provide a thorough and independent examination of this important issue. Over the past 14 months, Christensen has not only undertaken significant quantitative research, but has conducted extensive qualitative research as well, interviewing numerous shippers, railroads, and other stakeholders. Today, we are pleased to welcome two representatives of the Christensen team that conducted the study, Dr. Mark Meitzen and Dr. Kelly Eakin. Dr. Meitzen earned his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a vice president at Christensen Associates. His specialty is, amongst other areas, is in the cost and pricing analysis area. Dr. Kelly Eakin earned his PhD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's a senior vice president at Christensen, and Dr. Eakin specializes in the economic and financial aspects of competitive product pricing, amongst other areas. Dr. Meitzen and Dr. Eakin will first give a presentation generally summarizing the study process, its results, and recommendations. Following that presentation, my colleagues and I will have an opportunity to ask questions and engage in what I expect will be a lively dialogue. I look forward to this morning's presentation and discussion. And before turning the floor over to Dr. Meitzen and Dr. Eakin, I would now like to turn to my colleagues for any opening remarks that they might care to offer. Vice Chairman Mulvey.
This thing on? Oh, there it goes. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I have a few opening remarks. First of all, I'd like to say that I am in the process of following a current fashion here in Washington amongst economists, and to start out by saying I was wrong. My error was probably not as great as some other economists' mistakes, but in this case I was wrong because I was originally skeptical about the utility of this study. I thought that there should be a study more focused on the STB and how we've been regulating over the last dozen years or so, and I was concerned whether or not a broader study overlooking over the railroad industry at large was going to add much. And I'm happy to say that I have been more than pleasantly surprised. This is an excellent piece of work. I don't think the board could have gotten a better job from Christensen, so I want to thank you all for your work. I'm especially pleased that not only the quality of the work, but also the detail of the work. It is very easy to follow what the Christensen Associates has done. People who want to replicate what you've done and check it. Everything is laid out there, including all the econometric methodologies and how things were done and the results. It's just a first-class piece of work, so I want to thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Commissioner Buttry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. The long-awaited Christensen Association study of competition of the freight rail industry is on the street. And I might add that it's so popular it's also available on DVD already. So you can get it either way. Those working on the study should be commended for documenting an impressive number of interview responses and producing some very interesting graphic presentations. While I had no input into the study, I have read the executive summary and appreciate the effort that went into its completion. In fact, I think it is quite remarkable. With this in mind, and while I have a somewhat captive audience, I thought I might share some purely personal thoughts about the presumed subject of the study. In my humble opinion, the thought of a study conducted to look into the state of competition in the freight rail industry strikes me as almost humorous. Now, why is that, you say? Because in my view, to say that there is or is likely to be competition, real classical competition, in the freight rail industry is to indulge in a legal fiction. The fact is that freight rail has become so efficient that it has virtually no effective competition. So we're presuming to study something that essentially, in my view, doesn't exist. Only in Washington would we be studying something that does not exist. This is one of the reasons why the Christensen study is so remarkable to me. We actually have before us a document whose unstudied conclusion is that the subject of the study does not exist. Are we in New Mexico? The basic conclusions I have drawn from the study are three. That competition in the classical sense does not exist in the current freight rail industry. That when there is market dominance, there is the potential for misbehavior in the marketplace. And when there is misbehavior, there should be an accessible process to address that misbehavior. That process resides here at the Surface Transportation Board. In a perfect world, there would be no need for the STB, but we do not live in a perfect world. And as the Austrian economist, often quoted economist Joseph Schumpeter warned, there is always the temptation for monopolies to act like monopolies. So what is monopolistic behavior? Mr. Justice Potter Stewart was once asked, what's hardcore pornography? He responded by saying, well, it's hard to define, but I know it when I see it. So when is monopolistic behavior in the rail industry? Well, there are a lot of folks running around town who say they know what it is, and they've seen it, and someone needs to stomp it out before it spreads, like Smokey Bear stomping out a forest fire. But they have another name for it, and that name is profit. But profit is not a bad word. How much profit is enough? How much capital investment is enough? How much in dividends is enough? How many dedicated rail cars is enough? How much limitation liability is enough? How many customers on the line is enough? How much coal or grain or intermodal traffic is enough? Do we really want the Congress answering these questions? I don't think so. I think a lot of folks are asking the wrong question. The question is not how do we get more competition. It's how do we get more infrastructure and more efficiency where we need it and thereby get better results for everyone. So how do we get better results? Well, one answer is this. We have a process at the Surface Transportation Board where applicants can come in and get authority to build new rail line to compete with existing rail line. And I can assure you that any entity that avails itself of that process will get a fair hearing. That is not pie in the sky. It is reality, evidenced by recent board actions. The regulatory barriers to entry are minimal, and they are not regulated rates of return like those in other regulated industries. Is that a feasible answer to the lack of competition in the freight rail industry? Perhaps, although the cost is high. Short of that, I would suggest that the parties who feel they are aggrieved by monopolistic behavior, that is, market-dominant behavior, would be much better off working together with their rail partners for the common good rather than conducting guerrilla warfare, which just dilutes everyone's financial resources and energy. But of course, the problem is that the rail competition issue has been very good business for lobbyists. The patient never dies, and it never gets well. On the other hand, I'm beginning to sound like an economist. There is a process in place at the STB. It is being used, and it is working. If you are a shipper that has problems with your rail provider that cannot be worked out through private negotiations, come see us. Of course, if you are happier spending your hard-earned money to hire lobbyists to run around pursuing remedies which have virtually no hope of being implemented, go for it. But if you have the courage of your convictions, which means to me that you actually have an evidentiary case, then file it. In the meantime, we have yet another study. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Buttrey and Vice Chairman Mulvey. We'll now turn the floor over to Drs. Eakin and Meitzen. Look forward to your overview. Take as much time as you feel you need. If we get to the point where we feel we're losing the panel here or the board members, we'll jump right in. But we do want you to have plenty of time to. You spent 14 months on this. It's 700-plus page report last time I counted. So I want to give you ample time to give us the highlights. I'm sure this board will want to focus in on some of the policy recommendations that you arrived at and related issues. So without further ado, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. If we could have our presentation up. It is a somewhat daunting task not only to have done this study over the last 14 months, but also to try to summarize this in a concise manner in the time we have here, so we'll do our best. Oh, turn it on. As soon as we get used to the technology here, I'm sure we'll. There we go. We'd like to briefly talk about some of the underpinnings, the economic underpinnings of the study, and then talk about some of the issues that we addressed in the study. So we'll talk briefly about some background issues on railroad economics, but then get into the heart of the study, and I understand the interest in our policy conclusions, so we expect to have some back and forth on that, and we'll briefly introduce that and then answer whatever you'd like to ask us. And I would also say both Kelly and I would say feel free to interrupt at any point when a question seems to arise. That would be fine with us. Again, as you said, Mr. Chairman, we were retained to perform an independent assessment of the U.S. freight railroad industry, and among the issues that we investigated were the competition and captivity issues, capacity and service quality, and also an economic analysis of policy proposals. We had two primary phases to this project. The first being a stakeholder input phase, which many in this room are familiar with, we talked to numerous industry stakeholders from all ilks and interviewed in person over 60 stakeholders, also a number over the phone, and also through our website we obtained a number of emails and participation in the forum that we set up. And I will tell you, and I think as I've mentioned many times in other forums, we took everything we heard to heart. We considered everything thoroughly. It influenced the design of our research, and I think also we mentioned in our study there are some issues that did come up that were either outside the scope of our project or data limitations really prevented a thorough investigation that we think are important, and we did note many of those in our study and its conclusions. Just a background on railroad economics and maybe a way of getting some terminology out of the way that often tends to get introduced in these types of discussions. One of the key factors driving railroad economics is something called economies of density, which means that as you get more and more traffic over a given network, your costs tend to go down. You become more efficient. And because of that and the fixed costs involved in the railroad industry, as is the case with many other network industries, pricing at marginal cost will not allow you to cover total costs. So by necessity, prices are set somewhere above marginal cost, and by definition, price greater than marginal cost is by definition market power. But market power and the exercise of market power is something different than the abuse of market power, however you want to define that term. Also, I think it's a well-accepted policy and acknowledged by most that are familiar with the railroad industry. The way that you cover total costs in the industry is through differential pricing. Different shipping groups, different customers, different commodities pay different markups over their marginal costs so that the railroads recover their total costs.
Okay, so we, in our analysis, looked at the margin between the rate, or what we call the revenue per ton mile, and marginal cost. Our the data that we used come in this analysis, in this particular graph, come particularly from Railform 1, or known as the R1 data. The top series in this graph is the revenue per ton mile, and that is calculated from the R1 data. And the lower series is the marginal cost, which is estimated from it's obtained from a econometric cost function that is estimated for the freight railroad industry. What we see is the pattern of from the period 1987 to roughly 1995, 96, 97, that rates came down, but costs, marginal costs, came down even more rapidly. So what we will see later, or what is documented in the report, is that is the period of time when the so-called exercise of market power increased the most in this industry. But it is also, as we will see, the time that the railroad was moving up toward what we call revenue sufficiency. So we're sort of disentangling the exercise of market power and the achievement of revenue sufficiency throughout this report. What we see in this graph also of the last few years of interest is from about 2004 on, the rates, the revenue per ton mile has taken what we often call a dramatic turn upward, and that's what I think lots of the shipper community, if not all the shipper community, has felt. We also see that corresponding to that, that the marginal cost has also gone upward. And so through our analysis, we focused particularly on these last few years because that seemed to be the charge of the GAO report, and the assignment that we got is what has been going on in the last few years. Has this been markets operating the way markets operate, or has it been a so-called abuse of market power? So sort of coming to the bottom line conclusions on this, we conclude that recent years' rate increases are due to declining productivity growth and increasing costs, and not the increase in the exercise of market power. Now, market power is exercised, but its exercise did not increase over the last few years, is what we will see. And the conclusion on the exercise of market power and whether it's remaining constant or increasing is based on the market power index. A classic measure in the economics literature is called the Lerner index of market power, or the Lerner markup index, also sometimes its name, which is basically the markup of the rate per ton mile over marginal cost as based upon, or as the denominator being the revenue per ton mile. So price minus marginal cost over price is what the economists say. What we see again was that throughout the last 20-year history is that market power increased most when both marginal cost and the revenue per ton mile were falling, not the last few years when they were both increasing. And so in fact, a picture that captures it all is on the next slide. And here is the sort of history of the Lerner index, that it increases, sort of peaks out in the 1995 period of time, then comes back down at the end of the last decade, and then slowly climbs back up for the first few years of the 2000s, but from 2002 on, it is relatively flat. And so this is just sort of a summary of the finding that it's not the increase in the exercise of market power that has been driving the rates up the last few years, but instead what we further document is that it is the decline in productivity and the growth in input prices. So the recent declines in productivity growth and productivity growth and the increases in input prices are what has led to the recent years' increase in the revenue per ton mile, or the rates that the shippers pay. This is probably reflective of less ability for the railroads to absorb the cost increases through productivity gains, and that's reflected, it's corroborated by a different data source, which is the upturn in the adjusted RCAF series. And so what we also see in this period of time is that the increases in average and marginal costs have gone up in these recent years. And we've also seen a little spike in fixed costs. And as fixed costs go up, that adds to the overhead collection burden by the to achieve revenue sufficiency. So we see spike in fixed costs, increase in marginal and variable costs, and we also see differences in marginal costs by commodity over time. So just again, pictures that sort of verify the statements I just made is here's the RCAF-A graph that over the period of time of the what is the I think this is just the last few years, right?
89.
Yeah, okay, just from 89. That it declines over the, till about year 2000, stabilizes, and then in the last few years, the RCAF has started to go up, which is reflective of a productivity slowdown within the industry. Now, we can go further into that. Is that just reflective of sort of a general slowdown of productivity in the economy? Is it railroad specific? And those are some of the issues that we could go into deeper. So the way this gets translated as reflected in the R1 data is by looking at the railroad costs. And here we have, again, three series. The top series is the average total cost, so that is the per unit cost faced by the railroad. The middle series is the average variable cost, and the bottom series is the average fixed cost, so they add up. And so again, on this lower series, you can see that spike in the 2004-2005 period of average fixed cost going up a bit and adding upward pressure on the average total cost. What we see how these gets translated into recent trends in commodity rates is that rates and markups over marginal cost vary by the commodity groups and also within the group, so there's locational differences. We find that there are relatively larger markups for the agricultural commodities. The sort of big commodity groups we looked at were coal, chemicals, agricultural, and intermodal. But we went beyond that, but those are sort of the big groups. There's been some ability by shippers to adjust to counteract these increases by changing the nature of their shipment characteristics, such as length of haul or car loading. But that's limited, and that also doesn't capture the costs that are borne by the shippers to take those mitigating actions. So want to make sure that we're not being dismissive of that while the shippers have been able to counteract these increases, they've probably done so at some cost borne by themselves. However, not all shippers can adjust. And we do note at this point, and we'll probably come back to it later in the policy and further research recommendations, is that there seem to be some data problems with the intermodal data, and that most of the intermodal traffic seems to be lumped into category STC 46, which is called miscellaneous and mixed shipments, and probably that can be better separated and some improvements made in data collection along those lines. The next slide, which is terribly small and difficult to read these numbers, just shows the estimated marginal cost and the markups by commodities. Here we break it out into a 2001 through 2006 time period, but we break it into 2001 and 2003 and 2004 to 2006. We show what the markup index is, the learner index, and we also show the marginal cost, which is adjusted by shipment characteristics. And by and large, most of the markups between the two sub-periods, two sub-sample periods, stay relatively stable. There are just a handful that go up, and again, they tend to show up in the agricultural commodities over this period of time. We then turn to the idea or the concept of railroad revenue sufficiency, which is creating a measure of the revenue per ton mile divided by the average cost per ton mile. So this, an index of 1 or 100% would say that the railroad as an industry is just earning normal profits. For most years of the study, that is from 1987 to 2006, the Class 1 railroads do not appear to be earning above normal profits as reported in the R1 data. Now these results vary by railroad. Some railroads do have apparent positive profits. Other railroads have apparent negative profits. And for those interested in the railroad by railroad details, the appendix to Chapter 10 presents the same graphs that we're going to see on revenue sufficiency on a railroad by railroad basis. What we see, what we also note is that our findings using the R1 data to come to these conclusions is consistent with what we found from our financial market assessment, coming from completely different, actually non-railroad, more financial market statistics, looking at PE ratios and earnings per share. And we find that the performance over this period of time of the railroad industry as a whole has some similarities to that of electric utilities in terms of their returns. So again, the picture of this revenue sufficiency is this graph, which shows that for most years, the revenue sufficiency statistic for the industry as a whole appears just below 100%, usually in the high 95s, between 95 and 100%. There are just a few years where it has exceeded 100%, but the greatest amount by which it exceeded 100%, in fact, was the last year, 2006. And so that really raises the question of, are we beginning to see a trend of very strong railroad profitability at this point, or was that just one data point? And so we urge you to keep a watch on that, and as we will also, of what's going on in 2007 and 2008. So on the railroad sufficiency, let's see if this, there we go, issue, and bringing it back to the market power issue, because those are really sort of two separate issues, but they come together in terms of the regulatory policy, that we find that there's been no increase in market power in recent years as revenue sufficiency has improved, and that the greatest increase in market power actually occurred in the late 80s and early 90s, when the industry was mostly below and trying to achieve the revenue sufficiency levels. So we put these two curves, these two series together, and again, this was the same, the top graph is the revenue sufficiency graph that we just had up. It's a little bit more collapsed because of scaling, but it's the exact same curve or same series. And the lower graph was the previous graph of the Lerner index, but we think it's telling to sort of put these up together on the same graph so one can see the relationship between revenue sufficiency and the exercise of market power on the lower series.
The next area we'd like to talk about is the issue of shipper captivity. Now, it certainly comes as probably no surprise to anybody that within commodity groups, shippers with no or limited transportation options pay more than shippers that basically have the same shipper characteristics and better transportation alternatives. That's the way the markets work. But again, there is a question of, at some point, shippers with no alternatives, there are two issues. One is, how do we really identify them? And the second one is, once they're identified, what policies are implemented to maybe mitigate some of the issues that occur from shipper captivity. So regarding the measurement of shipper captivity, the RVC ratio, we understand, is a statutory measure that's used as the measure to assess whether there is an investigation of market dominance. But our research, one of the things we wanted to investigate is how well do RVC ratios compare to maybe an economic analysis of market dynamics in terms of trying to assess shipper captivity. So we took a look at, from our pricing models, we had a number of different market characteristics in terms of competitive transportation options or lack thereof, and we aligned these with RVC ratios, and some of the conclusions that we came to is that RVC is weakly correlated with market structure factors, the economic factors that would tend to define whether or not a shipper is captive or not. And not only do we find that it's not a reliable indicator of market dominance from a data point of view, but I guess indications that would tend to say it's not on its own a reliable indicator are things such as from an economic point of view, and I think we'll have an illustration here in a few minutes, is that there are cases where you could pretty much say a shipper was relatively captive when their RVC ratio is actually less than 180. So it's not all above 180. There are instances that could be investigated below 180 as well. And then another thing, table I'll put up here in just a second, shows that we actually found that the percent of traffic going at RVC ratios below 100, meaning if you take it literally, revenue less than its variable cost, those percentages are often greater than the percentages of traffic traveling above RVC of 300. So in other words, at both extreme ends of the distribution, you have issues in terms of measurement and a proper alignment of costs is what one of our conclusions is regarding this. And just to illustrate that point, I think I just turned off. I apologize. Hit the wrong button. There we go. Again, this may be a little bit hard to read, but the point here is to take from this chart is if you take a look at, we've broken down the percent of traffic by both tons and ton miles for two different time frames from the waybill sample data we had, the 2000-2001 time frame and 2005-2006 time frame. And at the left-hand side of the table, it's the proportion of traffic with RVC ratios less than 100. And you can see in the case of the upper table, as an example, both in 2000, 2001, and 2005 and 2006, 14% of the tons were actually traveling below a revenue less than variable cost figure. On the other hand, if you take a look at the other extreme, RVC greater than 300, you'll see 12% and 17%, so roughly the same proportions of traffic over 300 that are less than 100. And when you convert it to a ton-mile basis, the lower panel, you'll actually see the proportions of RVC less than 100 much greater. In fact, 3 times approximately greater, 3 to 4, 2 to 3 times greater than the proportion of traffic traveling above 300, which indicates to me and to us that it's not a very reliable indicator of what we're trying to measure here. In other words, extreme rates over variable cost. I did it again. Again, I'll just briefly say what this table is about. You can find this table actually in the executive summary. It's a table that said we looked at our various economic indicators of competition and captivity. For example, the distance to water alternatives, either at origin or destination, whether or not there was railroad competition at origin or at destination. And we correlated these economic factors with the RVC ratios, and across the board, these are very low correlations. In other words, the RVC ratio, the bottom line, doesn't correlate well with when you take an economic analysis of markets and look at what may be constraining rates, whether there's competitive options constraining rates. The RVC ratio doesn't correlate very well with those types of measures. Now, we did illustrate also in the executive summary, we took the case of wheat. And I'll throw up the maps here, and then I think Kelly has some numbers he can expand on this with. This shows RVC averages by county for wheat shipments. So the very dark areas represent the highest RVC ratios. And if I had my...
Greater than 300.
Greater than 300. Okay, thanks. I didn't want to pull out my glasses. So you can see just a very few dark spots by county where the RVC ratios are greater than 300. And I think the next gradation, the next darkest color would be between 180 and 300. So you see some darker areas in the upper plain states, which you might expect, where you'd see RVC ratios greater than 180. But now, if we take a look at our economic factors in the next map, I think we see a very different picture. Darker areas there. And basically what you're picking up there are a lot of, you might consider them insular areas, for example, that don't have access either to a second railroad or to water transportation. And so the economic factors would pick up basically a greater measure of, basically a relatively greater markup for commodities of wheat originating in those counties. Kelly, did you want to?
Yeah, and we do similar analyses and maps for the other commodities. We find that the wheat, this example was sort of the most obvious example of the disparity between the traditional RVC ratio and what we would call the market structure analysis. But we also find similar differences in the coal market. We will note that in the coal market, it is the destination as opposed to the origin that seems to be the more relevant market. What are the alternatives at the destination where the coal is going?
Could you spell out a little bit how the market factor metric is calculated?
Yes. We did pricing equations to where we estimated, tried to explain the differences in the revenue per ton mile coming off the waybill sample is what we're using at this point. And we have two sets of variables. One set of variables is a set of variables that is related to the cost characteristics of the shipment, and the other set of variables is the variables related to what we'd call the competition or the market structure, such as number of competitors, distance to waterway, and so forth. From the set of parameter estimates that we get on the competition or the market structure variables, we are able to isolate the impact on the revenue per ton mile because of the competition variables. Then we are able at that point to, on a county by county basis, compare how much a county for a commodities, how much the revenue per ton mile is marked up relative to the lowest cost or the most competitive county, if you will. That becomes our benchmark. And so then that's what in this picture we have the different color schemes. And so for wheat, for example, the fourth quartile or the highest markup, other things the same except for the competition issues, it's 87% higher than in the more competitive market. For coal, it's 78% higher at the fourth quartile. For chemicals, it's 65% higher. But interestingly enough, for corn, it's only 13% higher. So those are that just gives you a flavor of the type of analysis that's here. And we can break those, I mean, we just broke them into quartiles for right now for presenting here, but in fact, you can draw the line. It's like assigning grades or whatever. You can draw the line wherever the critical point is. We can't necessarily answer where that critical point is of where does it become a problem, where does it become abusive or whatever, but that's a judgment that's made. But you can have this methods to be able to sort all the counties by commodity and decide where the critical line is to where it warrants some sort of further investigation. Did that give you? Okay. So we do these for the other commodities and find that there are differences across commodities, but this gives you a flavor for both the sort of differential pricing across commodities and also the differential pricing within commodities across counties or across different markets depending upon market structure. I think that's
Okay, moving on to other topics that we looked at, briefly wanted to talk a little bit about our investigation of capacity constraints. And capacity is a complex issue, as it is in most network industries, because various measures of capacity and ways of picking it up often don't really give you the entire picture of what's happening. And I guess the best analogy, and we used it a few times in the report, I can think of just like other network industries such as communications or data networks, which are composed of switches, routers, and basically fiber optic cable. Often you'll have unlimited capacity in fiber optic cable, but you'll find that throughput in the network is constrained by a node where there are switching constraints or constraints on router capacity. So you've got a lot of capacity standing out there that's not being used fully because of constraints or congestion points in the network. And our assessment is, I guess not surprising, that we find that's the case with the railroad industry. We didn't find, in other words, there was a network-wide or system-wide lack of capacity from a number of different perspectives. We harken back to the Cambridge systematic study, which was put out a year or so ago, where they looked at corridor capacity, and they did basically a transportation engineering study of fairly comprehensive of railroad networks by corridor. And their findings were that 88% of corridor capacity was unconstrained, and I think only 3% was near capacity and 1% was over capacity at the current time. Now, of course, they then went on to say that the future may change based on their demand projections, which again, I think we also say that you have to be very cautious of those future demand projections because there are a lot of inherent assumptions in those projections that it's not clear that demand will ever reach the state that was presented in that study. But looking at from both that engineering perspective, and also we did some econometric work with our R1 data that basically looked at the contribution of capital, its value versus its cost, and we found that overall the value of capital, and there was no incentive for widespread network-wide investment in the networks because of what we found from our econometric studies. So basically the bottom line was, if you look at it just globally, you'd say that there's capacity there. But then the real question is the capacity all in the right places. So it's basically a location-driven issue. And the one thing we could do to investigate that issue somewhat is to look at terminal dwell time data to identify congestion points within each of the R1's networks, because the RPM data, which is collected, the railroad performance measures data, which is collected by the R1s, and they have a separate railroad performance measures website that has weekly data, and we were able to obtain that data going back to the beginning of that series in 1999 through 2007, and looked at various measures of terminal dwell time. And what we found were that in like the 2003 to 2005 period, across most of the 7 Class 1s, there were spikes in terminal dwell time occurring during that time period. In fact, the similarities between the Western railroads in particular, well, BNSF and UP, remarkably similar patterns, as you might expect. And not only that, then we peeled back from the overall dwell time and looked at individual terminals and found out that there seemed to be, for each railroad, key congestion points in each one of the networks, which again lends evidence to the fact that what's really the issue are these nodes in the network, key points that can cause system-wide issues. Now, sometimes we're not. That begs the question, well, what's causing the increase in terminal dwell time? And again, that could be a multitude of factors. I mean, it could be outages in the network someplace, like that happened in the Powder River Basin in the 2005 4 or 5 time frame. It could be weather-related issues, and then things just get backed up at certain points in the network. But nonetheless, I think the bottom line, in two conclusions, is that these are localized issues. It's not a lack of overall network capacity that's occurring here. But then I think the second thing that we found is that these periods of capacity tightness were not related to an increased exercise of market power. To kind of tie it back to one of the global questions that was on the table, are somehow capacity constraints and the exercise of market power linked somehow? And we didn't really find evidence that either capacity was being manipulated to enhance market power in any way from what we saw. But then I think the bottom line is it certainly did have an impact on service during that time, because one of the things that we also did, if we move on to the next, actually skip ahead, we looked at service quality and capacity issues. And again, the rail performance measures also have some information on train speed, which is a rough indicator, admittedly, of service quality, but it is what it is. And what we found is a fairly high correlation between terminal dwell time and service performance based on these measures. And we would suspect that if you had better measures of service performance, that you would be able to corroborate these findings and show that the capacity obviously did have an impact on service quality over this time frame. The one thing that we were able to do with the train speed data, they have it broken down by various types of trains: intermodal, multi-level, grain, manifest, coal. And to no one's surprise, multi-level and intermodal are the fastest services. But they did also, from 99 through 2005, have the greatest decline in average speed. And one of the reasons may be partly due to some large-scale construction projects that were occurring during those time frames. But then the other thing we did with the data were to look at variability in speed by type of train, because one of the things we heard a lot from shippers that we interviewed is, service standards are one thing, whether it's 5-day service, 8-day, or 9-day. That's one thing. But what really was more of an issue for shippers was the variability of the service. In other words, it was one thing to promise a 5-day delivery, and that'd be fine, so that everything could be planned around that. But if there were, turned out to be 7-day one time, 8-day another time, or 4-day another time, that was a bigger issue for shippers. So we looked at variability of train speed as well by these various types, and what we found, again, maybe not surprising, the lowest variability tended to happen with intermodal. It was the most consistent of the services. The greatest variability were with the grain and the coal. So from the R1 data, that's what we're able to assess. Now, I think we put in the report, and as I think we've alluded to in some of our previous preliminary findings, that we've heard from stakeholders and members of our advisory panel that there are probably better measures out there for service performance that either the railroads keep internally or shippers keep internally, and some process of trying to get better reporting of data on service quality, I think, would be something we would recommend. And in fact, I remember when I was here for one of the meetings, and I can't remember if it was RETAC or RSTAC, at one time there was a subcommittee looking at service reporting requirements and what could be done. And I think we would say that those are probably worthwhile endeavors to pursue. The final thing we'd like to talk to you about are some of our findings on the analysis of various policy proposals that have been recently forwarded for public discussion. Our starting point for this analysis was to look at what the GAO had said about various policy recommendations. In other words, which ones had they laid out as potential things that could be done to enhance competitiveness of the railroad industry. Things like reciprocal switching agreements, terminal agreements, trackage rights, the requirement to offer bottleneck rates, improvements in STB processes. So we took that as our starting point, and then we also looked at currently proposed or recently proposed legislation to see what was being offered or being proposed in the various bills before Congress. And our job, again, was not to basically advocate one policy or another. It was to perform an economic analysis, and from an economic point of view, from an economic efficiency point of view, try to analyze what were more favorable policies from an economic point of view, maybe point out what some of the distributional issues were, but not to say one was better than another. So one of our major conclusions, again, based on the findings that Kelly reported a little while back on revenue sufficiency, is that because of the status of the industry as of 2006, basically providing any kind of significant relief to one group would imply increases for other groups or threaten railroad financial viability. Again, the caveat here is whether or not that increase in revenue sufficiency that Kelly pointed out for 2006 is the start of a new trend, and it's something to keep an eye on. Overall, our assessment is that incremental policies, and by that we mean not wide-scale changes to railroad regulation, but incremental policies would have a greater likelihood of resolving shipper issues with a lower risk of adverse consequences. For example, of the policies that have been proposed, the ones that tend to fit the bill here would be things such as reciprocal switching agreements and terminal agreements, and also keep improving the process at the STB. Now, one thing that some of these policies may also benefit from is that to the degree that they can improve competitive responsiveness in the industry, in other words, actually enhance competition, it may actually expand the size of the pie that we're talking about here. In other words, there may be, from a distributional point of view, it may not be necessarily winners versus losers, but there may be gains for all parties in these policies. But I think that we recognize that not all shippers will benefit from greater competitive options. It's a case where some shippers are going to be captive regardless of whether or not there's greater competition among railroads or if other modes of transportation exist or not. And so in those cases, continued oversight will be necessary to protect those shippers. One of the things that we did in our executive summary and also in Chapter 22 of our report was to basically have a scorecard of various open access proposals that had been forwarded by various parties. The four being reciprocal switching, bottleneck rates, terminal agreements, and trackage rights. And the way we came to our conclusion that the incremental policies, such as reciprocal switching and terminal agreements, would be have the greater likelihood of resolving shippers at the lowest risk of adverse consequences, was to basically go down the checklist of various economic aspects of these policies and ask the questions: what would be the likely effects of these policies as they relate to, for example, economies of density, which would affect railroad efficiency, length of haul economies, what we call vertical economies. In other words, separating the operations from train operations from the maintenance and operation of the roadbed, railroad investment incentives, railroad profitability, the coordination costs between railroads, and the likelihood of competitive responses by other railroads if these policies were implemented, and also shipper gains from these policies. So based on our assessment of these factors, that's basically how we came to our conclusion that these incremental policies basically create the least economic distortions in the system and also provide the greatest hope for shippers through competitive response in our opinion. And I guess the other thing I would add that's not on this chart, but that certainly is a key consideration, is that in any one of these proposals that deal with open access, you have to deal with some kind of access charge. In other words, whether it be trackage rights, reciprocal switching, or any of these, what are you going to charge as a landlord to others to come in to use your facilities? And the experience of other network industries with this, and also with the railroads, has been that this is usually a very thorny problem. Again, harking back to my telecommunications experience, since 1984, when the telecom industry was first divested from the old AT&T days, which amazing how it's kind of reformed in recent years, but access charges have been an issue of contention since 1984, and also when they opened up networks to competition with the 1996 Telecom Act. Took a few Supreme Court cases to try to resolve these issues, so it's not an easy issue. And again, the more aggressive of these policies, our opinion is that it's going to become a greater issue.
Okay, so then we conclude our study in Chapter 23 with a discussion of future directions, and here we just list them, and I think it might just be the easiest to just now open things up to your questions, either on the future directions or further clarifications or other questions.
Thank you. That was a very thorough overview. We appreciate that, and certainly some stimulus for questions. I've got a few, and I'll stop and let my colleagues ask some, and I probably will come back and ask a few more. First, I think it's important. We have the benefit as commissioners of having good staff, excellent staff, who've been able to help brief us, answer our questions about this study in the last couple of days. Some of our guests may not have that benefit, and it's been a busy week with other minor matters being resolved around the country, and so they may not have had the time that we've had. So some of my questions will be things I think I already know the answer to, but I want to make sure we get out sort of on the record so we all understand. And a lot of it will go just to make sure we understand the data and the approach. Maybe it would help to maybe start off with maybe a more general question. The term competition does get used in different ways in economic circles. Sometimes it's usable differently in policy circles, and then really differently in sort of what I'll call political/advocacy circles. And I want to hear you, as two distinguished economists, just really elaborate on what you define as, what is competition, competitive forces. When you started this study, how did you kind of circle that and define what you were looking for as you looked at the issue of competition?
Well, I'll start and say that competition, in my mind, is the structure of an industry where the producers or the sellers in the industry are sensitive to what others who are also selling are offering for a price, so that there is some check on their behavior, because there's an alternative that the customer can go to. And so within the context of the railroad, that would include both Are there alternative railroads that the shipper can go to? And are there alternative modes of transportation that the shipper can go to? So it's mainly the sensitivity to recognizing that the customer either does or does not have those alternatives, and the degree to which they do have the alternatives. It's not a all or nothing type of concept. So.
And I would add to that, part of your question was, well, how did we view this concept coming into this study? Is that I think everybody knows the railroads are a very capital-intensive industry where the textbook Econ 101 example of atomistic competition, if you will, hundreds of firms competing for the same customers, is not going to happen. So, there's this realization, I think, that competition can be effective, but it doesn't necessarily fit the textbook case of what people learn in Econ 101 either.
And so just to follow up on that, the implication of that reality is that, in fact, the price in a competitively operating network industry may exceed marginal cost by necessity, which pulls back in the revenue sufficiency issue.
Okay. You did some comprehensive historical research and into the background of railroad regulation and economics, which was helpful in the report. Did you come across anywhere in ancient times or more recent times that, especially in more recent times, that U.S. regulatory policy has as a major focus guaranteeing a certain number of railroads in every community as the sort of the magic goal that we want to get to? So each person has at least two or more alternatives for rail service easily accessible.
I don't recall ever seeing that as a criteria, and I would say it would probably go against the sort of efficiency criteria to mandate anything like that.
I think in the pre-1920s, before the Act of 1920, there was a policy of enforced competition. But
I was a young kid then. Right.
Since well, Doug and I recall that, and but since that time, it has really backed away from the enforced competition strategy.
But the one thing about that, it's kind of a side issue that I think we allude to in the study, and I think it has implications for what the board is weighing now with your common carrier obligation deliberations, is that in a lot of industries, and I think we point this out in our chapter 3 of our study when we look at other network industries, is that there are things called universal service obligations in some industries like telecom, electric, postal, that have certain implications about serving everybody in some cases at the same price. And that's one kind of an obligation, and I think in many cases there's a fine line between what is the railroad's common carrier obligation versus this idea of a universal service obligation. And I think it's a very important issue, but I think it's one that's not very easily resolvable.
Just kind of getting back to my line of questioning, so it seems to me when you embarked on the study, you probably didn't embark on it looking as a quest for trying to identify the proper number of Class 1 railroads that ought to come into existence. We have about 7 now. Some people around town speculate that if we just had a lot more, if past decisions by past boards about mergers and stuff had been decided differently, there would be a greatly improved competitive landscape out there. Was that the quest you were on, to try to identify the right number of, if we just had, instead of 7 Class 1s, 10 or 15? Anything in your research that would lead us to believe that that's the goal we should be chasing?
No, that was not the quest we were on. We were looking at particularly the recent years and whether the increase in rates was a reflection of increase in the exercise of market power, or whether it was a reflection of changing market conditions in the response of a so-called competitive industry. We could probably gain some insights by looking at the data that we analyzed as to whether mergers in the past appear to have had one effect or another, but we did not, that was not our charge as I saw it.
Right, yeah, it wasn't the charge to say X is the optimal number of railroads, but I think you can also look at things such as we talked about before, economies of density, and basically the economics of the cost structure of the industry, and kind of get at it that way in terms of from an economic efficiency point of view. And I think that also has implications for whether or not competition would really work or not in terms of the number of effective competitors. In other words, what would be the economic properties, the cost properties of these competitors, and would there be efficient competition or not? So I think there are some implications that you could get out of the study in that regard by looking at those types of factors.
So it seems to me if we're looking at a market in an industry that by design and by regulatory and statutory design and oversight was never intended to guarantee multiple options for rail service in every community around the country, but also put in place in federal statute and regulation a number of priority considerations referencing competitive, the importance of competition and competitive effects. We've got to look for indicia of competition. We've got to look for market forces, substitutions, right? Substitutions to that very basic notion that the first thing you look for when you're looking for competition is where's the guy next door selling the same thing, or is there one? If there's not, okay, let's look deeper than that. That's why we have economists, and that gets me to marginal costs versus total costs. Could you just give us a little bit of Econ 101 or 102 about the distinction between marginal costs and total costs?
Sure. The total cost is sort of adding up all the different costs associated with providing a service for however much is provided. The marginal cost is the cost of providing that last unit of service or the next unit of service. And so the marginal cost is the concept that's connected to or is the measure that's connected to the concept of economic efficiency. Having price be equal to marginal cost is saying that the social value as represented by the price of the last unit just equals the opportunity cost to society of allocating resources to producing that unit. The total cost comes more into play in terms of, is the industry sustainable at the end of the day, in that are their revenues, how do their revenues stack up to their costs? So one deals with sort of the sustainability in terms of making adequate profit. The other one deals with efficiency in terms of how the value of the good being produced relates to the opportunity cost of the resources to produce that good.
And turning to revenue sufficiency, how would you define that? What do you look for if you're looking for whether an industry is revenue sufficient? It's
here we introduced that term, and we sort of steered clear of trying to. There's another term out there in rate cases, revenue adequacy. So we were trying to steer around that, just because we don't want to say that that's what we were, weighing in on.
The question steered around that too, but
right. Okay. But on revenue sufficiency, it's basically are the revenues for the industry as a whole, how do those compare to the costs that the industry incurs, the costs as a whole? And so for the graph that we put up showed for the industry as a whole, sort of that it's been hovering right around 100%, or that revenues just equal costs, which would translate into sort of normal industry profits. But again, I stress that can differ on a railroad basis, and you'll see those differences if you look at the individual graphs in the appendix to chapter 10. But again, to answer your question, it's the revenue versus the costs. If revenues are greater than cost, they're revenue sufficient. If revenues are less than cost, it's revenue insufficient.
And then how do you factor in some allowance for profit, for reasonable profit, or whatever someone might define as reasonable profit, whatever, enough to attract capital and that kind of thing?
In the measure that we used, there was a sort of fixed cost or a fixed capital cost component in there, and so there's an implicit return on, or an explicit return on investment on the capital stock. And so as long as that sort of payment to the capital stock is covered along with the payment to the variable factors like labor and materials and so forth, that is part of that payment to the capital is the sort of normal return to investment.
There seem to be in your data some interesting correlations, or maybe the opposite of correlations, between the rail industry approaching some level of revenue sufficiency and how shippers are treated, rates and market power, market dominance are evidence. It seemed that looking at one of your or more of your tables that in years gone by when the railroad industry wasn't quite as close to so-called revenue sufficiency, there may have been more exercise of market power being imposed. Help me understand how that would, sort of loosely in non-economic circles, people figure, oh, well, if the railroads have had a few good years, that means they must be more likely to be flexing their pricing power compared to when they were losing money or laying people off, et cetera.
Well, I guess the best example of that, going back to the graphs that compared the revenue per ton mile to marginal cost, is that period up till the mid-1990s, where both the revenue per ton mile, the price, and marginal costs were falling. But marginal cost was falling by more, so that the margin between price and marginal cost, in other words, the measure of market power, was actually increasing because, for lack of a better term, prices were more sticky in the downward direction. They weren't following lockstep the declines in marginal cost, I should say. But again, the context of that is that at that same time, I mean, the revenue sufficiency not only accounts for what's going on with marginal costs, but you've got a lot of other non-marginal costs, namely your fixed costs and your returns to your factors of production, your capital, for example, that go into covering your total costs. So at the same time, while their market power is increasing, in other words, there was a wider divergence between price and marginal cost, they were still not able to cover their total costs. And that's what Kelly was talking about before. Once you move off of that perfectly competitive ideal of hundreds of firms competing in a perfectly competitive market, price at marginal cost no longer allows you to recover your total costs. So in any event, regardless of whether we're talking about railroads or electric utilities or telecom, you're in what's known as a second best world. You have to figure out a way where you don't deviate as much from the ideal of price equals marginal cost to cause too many economic dislocations, but yet you have to allow the firm somehow to sustain itself.
And it occurs to me you need to have account in some way for an industry, when you're looking at revenue sufficiency in any industry, for that industry's sort of investment requirements in its own capital and infrastructure, for example, whether or not there are any mandates, for example, in law to invest in new technologies, deploy new technology with deadlines. All those variables, I guess, would go into, would occur to me, to kind of the cost of doing business, which then, of course, impacts whether or not one reaches revenue so-called sufficiency.
Yes, it would. It is in there. We, are, I guess, somewhat presuming that they are choosing cost minimizing technology, but if they were mandated to do something that they wouldn't do, if the railroad was mandated to make investment that it would not make otherwise, it would still be captured in those data, and the calculation of revenue sufficiency would still be that there would be a capital cost associated with that mandated investment that shows up in the data, that if that is covered along with the other variable costs, well then if the revenues exceeded that, they would be deemed revenue sufficient.
All right, let me pause there. I have more questions, but I want to let others have an opportunity. Vice Chairman Mulvey.
Thank you. It's an excellent presentation. I want to commend you again for an excellent study. I have a few questions. First of all, on the notion of economies of scale, I'm glad that, unlike sometimes we've had people unable to distinguish between economies of density and economies of scale, and your report makes that distinction very well. You seem to trace that the economies of scale that have occurred recently are really due to the long-term, the long-distance length of haul, average length of haul. But you've noticed that you note in Chapter 9 that seems to be tapped out. And the econometric results sort of suggest that this industry is, and individual railroads are achieving constant returns to scale, and there really don't seem to be any more economies of scale available. Does that have implication for future mergers, do you think?
Yeah, economies of scale are a central concept for merger analysis. We didn't go and directly make statements to that effect in this study, but if there were strong economies of scale, that would be an efficiency argument in favor of a merger. To the extent that there's not evidence of strong economies of scale, there would not be that efficiency argument.
Well, as you know, the board recently, or not so recently now, but reformulated its merger guidelines, where we need to have positive public benefits in order to approve mergers of Class 1s at this point, major Class 1s. And obviously one of those benefits would be economies of scale. And if absent those from the econometric analysis, it does make the idea of further mergers down the line to be more difficult to envision. Would you agree?
Yes.
One of the things I was interested in is on the learner index that you had on the chart back from 1987, and where the learner index back in 1987 seems to be around 12.5%. That does seem to be awfully low.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, you say, well, my God, given where it's coming from, it almost looks as though if you extrapolate it backwards, which is not always a good idea, but you would wind up with the railroad industry in the early 80s looking like perfectly competitive firm, and that's obviously not the case. Do you have any reason any explanation as to why the learner index was so low? Alan Lerner, by the way, was my professor at Berkeley for microeconomics a long time ago, so
I'll watch what I
seeing
say.
his work.
Yeah, I don't know absolutely, but I think, this is an econometrically based function, and 1987 is at sort of the far end of the data, and so I think a lot of this is some of it is that the fit of the cost function itself from which this curve is derived is not as statistically strong at the tail end, 1987, and a lot of that's driven by the fact that you had lots of smaller railroads that were just in the data for 1 or 2 years, that the sort of cost function estimates, if you get down into the econometrics, really stabilized starting in the 90s. So I think there's a wide variance around that. Okay. So I'd just leave it at that.
That leads me to another question on data needs. You guys have mined a lot of data recently. You used the Waybill sample. You looked at some of the cost data that the board collects. And I was wondering if in your analysis that you found large gaps in the databases that should be fulfilled. And one of the things about deregulation is that deregulation did lead to a reduction in the amount of data reporting on the part of the railroads. It's true of all industries. And that's sort of a cost to those who continue to still need to regulate and to analyze these industries. Did you identify any particular data series that might be useful to begin to require again, especially since there's legislation in the Congress now that's going to look at the STB and the railroad industry and might in fact require some more reporting of some of these key data series?
Well, I think, I don't know if I'd say again, but I think as I mentioned before, anything that can be done to collect better data on performance and service quality related issues, I think is going to be really important, because going back to what we heard in our stakeholder interviews, a lot of shippers were concerned about the service quality they were getting. And quite honestly, one of the things we heard is there seemed to be a correlation between service quality, an inverse correlation, if you will, between service quality and rates. We're paying higher rates and we're getting lower service quality, things like that. Now, those are certainly important issues to investigate, which, you know, is another aspect of whether firms are behaving competitively or not. Is there enough competition to ensure proper service quality? But those types of issues were largely, you know, reported in the statements we received, but empirically there was no real way of investigating it beyond what we could do with the rail performance data.
And on that particular set of data on service quality, you know, we've got pretty strong indications that the railroads do collect that information. So it's more of a reporting rather than reporting, going out and having to collect something new. It's more collecting, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, the board is looking at some of its data series, including the Uniform Rail System of Accounts, and to see whether or not that needs to be updated. I mean, some of those relationships that are used in that date back to engineering relationships in the 1920s, and obviously it would certainly help to improve those databases, albeit it's a big and expensive job to do. So we'll have to see whether or not monies will be available to do that. But clearly, better data leads to better analysis, and you guys did an excellent job with what you had. I did notice that, for example, the data index for intermodal was negative.
Right.
Which is extremely difficult to understand that one.
It is.
But having said that, you also point out that the data that we have in intermodal is so broad, you don't really know what's being carried in these boxes. And again, it might be useful if we could get more detail as to how what is constituting intermodal shipments.
Yes, in fact, that was going to be the second one I was going to mention off the top of my head is there were these issues in intermodal, and I think we have some ideas of what was causing it. It has to do with what's reported in the waybill sample.
The graphic that's the chart that you have at the end of the report, looking at the potential impacts of intermodal proposals, and you have 4 proposals and how they would affect various things like railroad profitability, coordination, cause. Now, that's not based particularly on an econometric analysis. That's based upon your knowledge and your thoughtful assessment of how these would be, as opposed to being derived from any of the analysis done in the prior chapters, correct?
By and large, that's correct. I mean, some of it we do draw from, like on the economies of density type of stuff. It has some basis to the econometric function that's estimated in Chapter 9, but no, a lot of this is qualitative, theoretical.
Well, and also based on the results of other studies that we reviewed.
Right, certain. Right.
One other thing, and that is you talked about the negative productivity gains that we've had in recent years, and you point out the possible reasons for that, why productivity growth has slowed down, and you mentioned also the sizable capital investments that the railroads have made recently, and that maybe we will see those come to fruition and see those pay off in the near future. Would you recommend that 5 years from now, say we go back and look at this again to see whether or not that is indeed the case?
It would satisfy my curiosity. Yeah.
I suppose we're also satisfied if we also re-engage you look at that one again. But yes, it does strike me because railroad productivity gains were substantial following staggers, and in fact, I think some analyses show that railroads achieved more productivity gains than virtually any other industry for a while, but those seem to have slowed down.
Yes, and I think, you know, there's a couple things going on there. I think there's always a cyclical component to productivity, and a lot of it has to do with the interaction, as you point out, between investments and when they pay off. But then I think a lot of what happened after staggers too a lot of it was one time. So the question is, what's the real long-term trend? And I don't know if we've really seen it yet.
You know, certainly major gains right at the staggers, as railroads were given a lot of freedom to do things they would have done if they could have beforehand and were able to do at the staggers. You also note that it's very you talk about the Cambridge systematic study and the forecast of demand for rail service. This is brought up all the time, that the demand for rail traffic is going to quadruple, quintuple, or what have you in the next few decades. And yet, absent sufficient infrastructure, that really can't happen. You suggest that there's still a lot of capacity out there, and that that there are bottlenecks in that capacity, and that if we focus our investments in those bottlenecks, we may have a lot of capacity to handle much of this expected growth. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think partly yes. I think the other part of that is how will those demand projections come to fruition? And I think that's a big question mark as well, because I think there are a lot, as I said before, there are a lot of assumptions that go into those, and I think they're not always based on looking at economic reactions or incentives to various phenomena. So I think a critical analysis of those, as we put in our future research considerations, one of the areas is critical evaluation of these future demand projections.
Too often these projections are sort of straight lines, assuming that tomorrow is going to reflect yesterday.
Yes.
And obviously we're already seeing changes in overall trade flows, and these could continue, this could reverse themselves, and there are other things that could happen which could totally change the whole flow of logistics in this world, and that would affect the demand for rail service. So, thank you.
Commissioner Buttrey, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you get down to the last commissioner, it seems that most of the good questions have already been asked, but I dare say all of us in the room have a favorite political cartoon that we remember from some point in our life or our college years or whatever. I remember one that was particularly fond of that showed a picture of Teddy Roosevelt with a huge club in his hand. And he had it cocked back over his shoulder. Somebody's shaking their hand out there. They seem to remember this one too. He's shaking his, he's got it cocked like he's a baseball player, and he's going to hit something with that club. And in front of him is this really ferocious looking, lion looking character, animal, and written across the back of the animal is the word Monopolies. And he's got this big club drawn back like he's going to go after this roaring lion, as it were. I've always thought that was a really interesting and telling political cartoon. I thought of that cartoon while I was reading through your study, and I want to assure you that my opening comments today was not designed to cast any poor light on your efforts and your work, because obviously you put a lot into this, and I agree with the other board members. It is a revealing document. I just don't have much like of studies. In any case, I think we'd be better off if we were building things rather than studying things. But anyway, I'm just looking for maybe one takeaway from this study. There are probably several takeaways, but I'm looking for one in particular. And I know I'm going to ask you to do something that you really don't want to do probably, but you can take a shot at it and get as close to it as you can. I seem to conclude from your study that while you may not agree with me that railroads are monopolies, that's an argument for another day possibly, but anyway, I'm looking for some thoughts from you on whether you think there is misbehavior, if you will, in the marketplace with respect to the rail industry and its customers. And I seem to take away from this study that you don't find any particular grievances in general with respect to that issue. And maybe I read this study wrong, and if I did, you need to point out to me where I missed the point. But what my takeaway is that you don't really see any grievous behavior of the monopolistic, traditional, classical monopolistic style behavior based on your analysis. Can you speak to that as eloquently as you can and give us a takeaway on that? Both of you. Or
I'll start and say that there are two phrases that we repeatedly saw or that come to mind. One is an abuse of monopoly power, and the other one is fair price. And it is difficult for an economist doing economic analysis to define what is an abuse or what is fair or not fair. And that's really a policy decision. What we have tried to do with this study is inform that policy decision as much as possible. So where one draws the line and says, over this line, it's an abuse if a particular customer faces a markup more than a certain amount, where that line is drawn, we can help you determine, how often that happens and which customers and which places and which pockets that happens at. But drawing that line is something we don't do, and it's not an economic conclusion. The fairness conclusion is a policy type of conclusion. So while you may, have said the takeaway that you come away with is that we did not say that there was any evidence of abusive behavior, that's because it's a hard thing for an economist to define and conclude on, because it's a fairness concept, not an economic analysis concept. It doesn't mean it's not there, but it's not our judgment. It's not our place to make the judgment that it's there.
In fact, I would say that our study offers ways of, however you want to define abusiveness, of detecting it maybe better than the ways that are out there right now. So I think we recognize there are rates out there for relatively captive shippers that are much in excess of rates for similarly situated shippers who have alternatives. And I think we do point that out. But again, I would echo Kelly's sentiment that whether that's right or wrong, it's really not our call. We can help you identify and point those out, but it's really a policy decision as to where that line is. And I think, again, it gets beyond rates. Are there issues with how shippers and railroads interact with one another that are indicative of maybe not enough competitive pressures on the railroads to provide good service, for example? Those issues, I think we tried to highlight where we could, but empirically we didn't have the data to really investigate thoroughly how that connection may work.
And let me throw one more thing in there, is that we do recognize that there are shippers, due to their characteristics, whether a lot of them are geographical characteristics, that are inherently more vulnerable to higher prices. Whether that's abusive or not is a different question, or not the judgment we're going to make, but that there is a vulnerability there that we can detect and recognize, and to the extent that one is interested in protecting those who are vulnerable in that situation, we can help you sort of see where those pockets and those particular instances are.
You use the terminology market structure in some of your graphics.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be accurate? Would it do any damage to your analysis or your data graphics to substitute for market structure the term captivity?
The reason we would probably resist doing that is because captivity is sort of determined by those structural characteristics, and it's again not a clear point to where captivity is yes or captivity is no, but it's much more of a continuous variable or measure or concept. And captivity also may carry connotations that mean different things to different folks, so it might confuse the issue more. So we deliberately chose structure to avoid the use of it. But
captivity is kind of a emotionally charged word.
Right, that's what I'm trying to say.
Going back to your economies of density concept, economies of density actually comes to a point where it actually hits a wall, does it not?
It appears to. I mean, the evidence. It's an empirical question, but yes, the empirical answer seems to be that economies of density do get exhausted.
So you get into a situation where you become very efficient and more efficient and more efficient and more efficient, and all of a sudden you find out the next day you're less efficient because you're trying to put more and more density on a defined and limited infrastructure.
Eventually, the sort of the fact that things are getting more crowded on the system, that cost, which is always increasing as you put more traffic on the system, that eventually outweighs the economies from putting that more traffic on the system. So it's sort of it's at a margin where the last unit eventually adds more to congestion than it does add to the efficiency.
Would you agree with the idea that the quickest way and the best way to get better results for everybody is to have more infrastructure in the right places?
I think generally, yes, we agree with that.
Maybe that ties into the stimulus package, Frank.
Well, I think
that's all the questions I have at the moment.
I just wanted to follow up on what Doug was just saying. He was talking about a fixed network, and if it gets overused, eventually you begin moving up the short-run average cost curve. But as you said before, if the industry indeed is experiencing constant returns to scale, then one can invest in the infrastructure to expand the size of the capacity and still keep unit costs around the same, correct?
Yes.
I'd like to follow up on that too, because as someone who's worked in the area of infrastructure policy for a number of years, I would like to think, it's my first instinct to think that if we could just get additional infrastructure at all locations where it's desired, problem solved. But when I read your report, when I go to school on a little more of economics, I get a little different impression that, in other words, if you look at the impact on the industry and making it attractive to go into the rail industry, if you were to magically, if the government were to come in or someone else were to, through policy incentives, actually achieve the outcome of additional rail infrastructure at all locations where enough people, there's a certain threshold of customers desiring that additional infrastructure, what does that do to the market as we know it today? And because there's some history for that in our country, we're just coming, we're at the end of an era of, it's still petering out, but of a lot of abandonments, a lot of lines that crisscrossed America that are no longer in existence, and presumably that's for a reason. But can you expand on that from an economic perspective?
Well, I think it's partly economic and partly behavioral. Again, from some of the feedback we received, to kind of expand on your point of after the experience of decades of downsizing and shedding what appeared to be excess, most of, from what we understand, at least an opinion that was expressed to us, is that railroads were used to cutting costs and looking for ways of shrinking networks to make them more efficient. So it really took a shift in mindset then to say, well, maybe we're at a level now where we have to start thinking the opposite direction. So in one respect, it can be just as much of a mindset as it can be the economics of the situation. So I think some of that probably one way or another factored into maybe you can look at this as some kind of a transition phase. In other words, one way of looking at capital investment, it's a lumpy investment. And especially in an industry that's as capital intensive as railroads. I mean, it literally is sunk investment once you put it in. And so under those situations, oftentimes you're almost accidentally at the optimal level. I mean, you'll by accident either have enough, but typically it'll either be too much or too little, depending on where you are in your investment cycle. So it's actually a lot of skilled forethought and planning, I think, that goes into these things. And from what our understanding is that's one thing a number of railroads have been working on over the intervening years, is getting better at their abilities to identify areas where capacity is needed and to employ the proper techniques to make sure that investment gets deployed efficiently and not in haphazard ways like maybe once was done, and that we're basically seeing the legacy of that now.
Thank you. I wanted to revisit the table on page 18. I don't know how hard it would be for you to pull it back up, but I've got it in front of me, so I don't need you to myself, but it might be helpful to everyone else in the room. This is the one that titled percent tons and ton miles by revenue and over variable cost category, where we actually, you educate us a little bit on what I might call sort of the winners and losers, perhaps, in the system we have now. You point out that, I guess I just want to make sure I understand the data. You've got, first of all, what's the distinction between, you've got a top two lines, a top period, and then you've got the same data for, what's the difference between the top half of the page and the bottom half of the page?
The top half is just total tonnage, percent of total tonnage. So those are the figures for 2001 and 2001 and the 2005, 2006 time periods based on looking at tons. The lower part of the table are for the same two time periods, but the measure there is the percent of ton miles. So that's the distinction between the two. And they give you, I guess you'd say, qualitatively similar answers in terms of a lot of the information, but obviously there are some distinctions whether you use tons or ton miles as your measure that you're looking at, and that's why we wanted to present both of these, because they do give you a slightly different view. And again, the takeaway that we saw here in one of the illustrations is that, roughly speaking, if you look at both ends of the distribution where RVC is less than 100 or it's greater than 300, you're seeing a lot of traffic measured by this RVC ratio, whether you're measuring it in tons or ton miles, that looks like its revenue is less than its variable cost by this measure. And again, it's an illustration of some of the unreliability of the RVC measure as we see it.
So to understand this, they're just looking at, for example, the lower table, the percent of ton miles by RVC. It shows that there is the 2000, 2001, 2005, about 19 to 20% of the traffic is actually moving at less than 100% of RVC.
That's what it shows.
I'll put that in plain English. Does that mean the railroad's basically practically giving away the transportation? I mean, in other words, losing money on that, willing to lose money on that movement?
I think what we're saying is that it brings into suspect the quality of the data, of the URCS data. Right?
Could there be any other explanations for it? Would this include contract data? You may have a contract that was entered into 9 years ago, the 10-year contract. Somebody...
Yeah, it's worthy of trying to figure out why we get this anomalous result.
Another possible reason might be, I don't know, of course, would be competition between motor carrier, trucking, and railroads. Railroads being willing to aggressively go after that traffic so long as their total business package gives them a profit.
You start to get on a little bit thinner sort of theoretical ice there in terms of, losing that much on every unit but making it up on volume type of problem.
Mr. Chairman, can I horn in here on your question time? Since we're,
yes, sure.
Just to follow up on what you said, I mean, given the fact that especially the Western railroads, a huge percentage of their revenue is coal, unit train coal, and given the fact that the revenue per ton mile on that coal traffic is, I guess, the lowest there is, certainly for a commodity anyway, does that distort these? What does that have a distorting effect on these numbers?
Well,
or is it a worrisome distortion or not?
I think if you took a look at the work we did in looking at margins over marginal cost of coal, I mean, our work would show that despite the low revenue per ton mile of coal, there was still a positive margin from the data we looked at. Our economic.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that. I'm
No,
just
no.
saying,
But
does
what I'm just trying to then relate it to this and say, to me again, that indicates it's not so much behavioral that this is reflecting what's going on out there, but there's something with this data that really merits a real close investigation.
If I could add his question about on page 19, you have a column revenue per ton mile for the various commodities. Is that a quality coefficient of some sort, or is that the actual RPTM?
Which it's the table.
Table 19.
I believe that's the correlation coefficient.
That's the correlation. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Returning to the table on page 18 with the percent of ton miles by RVC category. I want to make sure I understand. So you're suggesting there's not really any plausible, economic, rationally economic reason that there would be 19 or 20% of ton mile traffic moving it below 100%. So there must be a data error or some problem there.
I'm not absolutely saying it's a data error, but I'm saying it points. It's a red flag that comes up that says it's worth looking at. Your example of if there were longer term contracts and things have changed and so now the contract seems to so-called be out of the money, that's an alternative explanation and we'd want to sort those things out. So
right, but even having said that, it would have to be an overwhelming proportion of traffic for us to observe this with data that we had 100% confidence in.
So if there's not a lot of confidence in the data on that end of the spectrum, how much confidence do you have in the data on the high end, on the traffic that's supposedly over 300% of RVC?
I'd say probably about the same amount of confidence as under 100%.
And then, when we put the map up for wheat, I mean, we think that kind of is a good example of these things just don't correlate, and that you even look at where the RVC, some of the over 300% sits right on the Columbia River, which is is less than a mile from the water access, but it's it just doesn't match up with the market structural characteristics. So I mean, we obviously in our report tend to say we put more faith in the market structure sort of stuff. So we're setting this table up as this isn't doing such a good job, we think.
I wanted to explore that a little bit. So if, and because of course by statute we're directed to pay a lot of attention to RVC, I've never been able to find the answer to exactly who came up with the 180% magic number. I'm told it didn't come from the ICC, the STB's predecessor, and it likely came based on a knowledgeable staff person's best judgment late at night as they were wrapping up the Staggers Act. But it is what it is. It's in law. So expound on what alternative approaches might be more useful if the current focus on RVC is of questionable value. Expand on your suggested alternatives as to what we should be looking at to be determining whether there are market power at play and or inappropriate market power.
Well, I'll start off, and I think just reiterating what Kelly said before, and I'm not sitting here, I don't think we're pretending to have all the answers or say, let us do it, but I think we've got something here that shows you that if you consider the economics of the situation, and as Kelly was giving you the examples of, I guess, what we would call relative captivity, in other words, the quartiles of markups by these various commodities, something could be done to, by commodity, again, do this type of economic analysis, but it would be up to some policy decision to say, well, where's the line where high is too high? That's something that basically economic efficiency, or as an economist, without putting value judgments into the analysis, couldn't really tell you. We could lay things out for you that way, but I think ultimately it would be a deliberation to say, okay, anything in the fourth quartile we're going to consider to be captive shippers. Something to that nature would be one possibility. The other thing I would say is that I understand there are still a few qualitative factors that are considered in market dominance deliberations, and I know they're quite complex and can often drag out in the deliberations, but maybe some way of trying to tighten up or expedite the analysis of the qualitative factors in market dominance determinations might be some way of doing it. In other words, unfortunately, you'd still be stuck with the RVC 180. And again, we vividly recognize that that's by statute. And, but again, we're here to tell you there are probably cases of captive shippers who require some kind of relief or at least some review where RVC is less than 180 as well. So it cuts both ways.
And I guess I'd also like just to add to that there's sort of two different approaches as far as how do we go about implementing something else. One is to see if there is something wrong or something inherent in the URCS database data that could be fixed. And then the second is supplementing it with alternative or with other data sources, which are these market structure characteristics and analyses using things such as the waybill sample, which by this report we have demonstrated the concept works, that this can be done, and it might be something that the staff here could just sort of set up programs to do. I mean, so you can just run these things and identify the hot spots, so to speak. But I guess the final thing is that in at least one of the proposed legislation, it was suggested that the RVC ratio of 180 be the only criteria and the final and determinative criteria or something like that. And we would just say, as things stand right now, we don't think that's a very good idea.
Your overview touched on this, but your report was a little more detailed on it. You did look a little bit at the question of whether there was enormous or extravagant railroad industry profiteering relative to other major industries. We hear that sometimes in the public arena, allegations of sort of unreasonably high profits in the rail industry. What did your study and research indicate on that question?
Well, what we did is we benchmarked railroad financial performance, tried to put on like a financial analyst's hat and look at the railroads as maybe a financial analyst would. And we looked at various measures that are commonly used, whether it be earnings per share, price earnings ratios, EBIT, EBITDA, all of the financial alphabet soup. And we found that over time, through the period of our analysis, which ended in 2006, that the railroad performance in a lot of ways was very similar to electric utilities in terms of earnings per share, price earnings ratios, things like that, and also consistent with some of the measures for the S&P 500 composite. So from that perspective, up to that point in time, there didn't seem to be, for example, on the price earnings ratio, there wasn't a huge premium commanded for railroad stocks, which would indicate that there wasn't a willingness of the investment community to be paying a premium to hold the railroad stocks, which would indicate that they didn't see this as one where it was the next Microsoft or however you want to characterize it. Of course, I would just add a caveat that I think since our period of our study ended, even last week I noticed some analysts' reports came out giving glowing recommendations to the railroads. So I'm not exactly sure how those types of factors would alter any of the types of conclusions of our data through 2006. But just going back to what we did do in our study, looking at these various benchmarks, they seem to be railroad industry financial performance seemed to be lined up with some general trends of other benchmark industries in the S&P 500.
Your study also seemed to identify a reality that we often have to grapple with here, which is that kind of the consequences of certain policy alternatives. I get back to kind of the phrase winners and losers. It's challenging enough to identify who some of the stakeholders in our regulatory world are who are disadvantaged by the current system. We often don't hear from, because they're presumably fairly content and are busy being content pursuing their businesses. We don't often hear from the folks who are satisfied customers of the railroads, I'll say. But your study seems to indicate that there are, of course, some of those at least out there, and that as far as and that there are consequences to driving down rates for certain identified disadvantaged rail customers, presumably would require railroads to respond. How? If you could just elaborate on that.
Well, I think one of the analogies that we use is sort of pushing on a balloon, that if the box that a balloon is in or whatever is just at the revenue sufficient level, then if you give relief to one set of customers, it's got to, for the viability, that it will likely result in rate increases for some others. And so there's, if there are above normal profits for the industry, then perhaps relief can be given without that impact going on to other customers. But that's a challenge of how that actually comes about. What I think we can see, or what can this study starts to shed some light on, is that any given particular reform, we can probably, like reciprocal switching, we can probably identify the likely winners from that because of their situation that meets the characteristics of where they would benefit from having that reform go into place. We can also look at the sort of commodity-specific markups and also those county-specific maps to see, of the set that doesn't sort of meet the characteristics to benefit from the reform, how the sort of the gain on this side is going to be pushed off as pain on that side, and how that pain is going to be distributed to those others according to those market structure characteristics. So I might have lost the thread of the question, but that's...
Did your research tell you anything about the type of shippers who most likely are benefiting under the current regime? Wouldn't they be shippers who have options, shippers who have modal options, alternatives?
Yes, in fact, as your one particular came to mind that we interviewed, and I forget the exact commodity, but they were a shipper who basically was able to locate and have transportation options part of their locational decision. In other words, they weren't stuck in one place, and they could basically cite to where they could get the best deal. They weren't necessarily, it wasn't a commodity where they, because it was a bulk commodity where rail made the most sense. I mean, they could do truck, they could do water, they could do rail, and they were perfectly happy with their railroad service. And most likely because they did have all these options, and they had more leverage than other shippers did. So yes, we did see some of that depending on your circumstances, and whether you felt you were relatively captive in one way or another, and again, not using captive in a sense of maybe a more common sense where shippers felt they were captive, and if they did feel they were captive, I think they saw or they perceived that they weren't getting such a good deal from the railroads.
Vice Chairman Mull, you've been patient. You'd like to take a turn?
I just have one other question. And every report, no matter how big it is, will be scrutinized, and people will come up with a sentence or so. And there's one sentence putting on in Volume 2, Chapters 10, pages 11 and 12, where it seems to be somewhat contradictory, and I would like if you would take a second to cover and clarify the seeming contradiction. It says, first, the exercise of market power appears to have increased in the freight railroad industry over the last 20 years. And of course, you point out that the increase was necessary in order to cover fixed costs. But then, just at the end, you say, finally, the substantial increase in revenue per ton mile appears to be largely the result of increases in variable, fixed, and marginal costs, and not due to the increased exercise of market power. So there seems to be a conflict there, and I'd like you to try and clarify it.
I don't have the sentence right in front of me, but I think it should say in recent years. Would that
That would
clarify?
that would help a lot. That's what
Okay, I think
but
that's, I mean, because that's what the pictures were, and
Right.
that's really what we were trying to focus on, of what's been happening sort of since 2000.
But I wanted to get that on the record, that this is a change in recent years.
Thank you for catching that. I'm sure that's the only mistake in the report.
Well, on page 9.
And in case you were concerned that no one had actually read the whole thing, you now know that at least one person has. Commissioner Buttrey? I have a couple more. I hope my colleagues can bear with me. But just want to make sure we understand all this data in front of us. Your overview mentions and your report mentions Surface Transportation Board process improvements that would be helpful or what might be beneficial. One of the reasons, frankly, I was interested in an independent consultant assessment is that when we receive reports on things like STB process improvements from an independent consultant, it might mean something different to our stakeholder audience than if we have our hired staff who we have to do performance evaluations for every year, et cetera, and decide whether to promote or not, give us their best effort at critiquing the board and its processes. So that's really, I'm anxious to hear a little more discussion of those thoughts and ideas you have.
Sure, I'll start off. Well, I think part of the response to that can be found in Chapter 5, where we report on our stakeholder feedback, and we do report some of the things we did here regarding STB. And as you might imagine, I'm sure as you well know, there's a mixed bag out there. Some people thought things were okay, and minor changes in processes were in order, and others probably have your ears burning a little bit more. But I think again, given our charge, which was not to kind of have this micromanaging analysis of how the STB does its job day to day, but look at what policy proposals were out there and on the table right now. There were a few that we're talking about, for example, the simplified rate guidelines and things like that. And I think part of what we're saying is, and understanding that there have been recently the 3 cases filed and decided on appeal right now, but continuing efforts to make sure that those processes are accessible and working correctly, and constant oversight on those things. Another thing that had been recommended, I think, in the GAO study and may show up in one of the current or recent proposals before Congress, was more use of final offer arbitration for various disputes. And we did hear from a number of our stakeholders that they saw some benefits. One of the things we heard is going to Canadian-style regulation. They saw a lot of benefits there. And of course, we saw other people who didn't think it was so great. But the 2 things that came out of there were the idea of the reciprocal switching, which is one thing that is aside from the STB processes, but the use of final offer arbitration as a way of, and a lot of times even avoiding getting disputes to the board. In other words, a way of getting the parties to come to some agreement, having that hang over their heads that there would be somebody deciding this if we don't do it ourselves. So things like that probably merit further investigation. However, I think we also know that there are some downsides to final offer arbitration, maybe as proposed, and also the way it's done in Canada. And one of the big things we see as something that should be discussed is what is the background and experience of the arbitrators? Do they know enough about these issues to make some informed judgments? I think it's a difficult situation. But that certainly is one consideration. So I guess to answer your question, the two things that come to mind in terms of improvement in STB processes would be just a constant evaluation of how well the simplified guidelines are working, and whether or not the shipper community feels like they have access to the types of STB responses that they feel they need, and also the consideration of final offer arbitration more widely.
Okay. I want to make sure I understand. On page 26, you have the table of looking at the economic impact of you call open access proposals. And these terms get bandied about a lot, and one would think they all reside in the Oxford dictionary, but I've tried looking them up, and they basically don't. So if I could maybe get your first sort of definition, quick definition of reciprocal switching, bottleneck rates, terminal agreements, and trackage rights, so we all kind of know what we're talking about here.
Sure. Both reciprocal switching and bottleneck rates are two types of proposals that involve interchange of traffic between two railroads. There's a handoff involved. Typically, reciprocal switching occurs close to an endpoint of the movement, whereas under the current proposal in the pending proposed legislation regarding bottleneck rates, I believe it says that there has to be a rate offered basically between any 2 points in a railroad's network. So, but the commonality that those two proposals share is that it involves an exchange of traffic between one railroad and another railroad. On the other hand, terminal agreements and trackage rights, the commonality there is it's basically some kind of a run-through provision, where either you have access to another railroad's terminal area so you could complete an end-to-end movement, or through some segment of their network through trackage rights, and you could complete an end-to-end movement. So basically that's kind of the very broad definition of what these particular policies are.
You did point out towards the end of your presentation that although your report didn't delve into this in great detail, I don't think that all of those proposals, reciprocal switching, bottleneck rates, terminal agreements, and trackage rights would trigger an access charge, some type of arrangement. Now, many of those arrangements, I think everything except maybe bottleneck rates, do exist out in the marketplace voluntarily, correct?
Yes.
So they're out there. They're just not out there to the degree to meet everybody's fancy. The problem, though, of course, the challenge is when you introduce involuntary arrangements. It's sort of akin to dumb it down about 30 degrees. If you take your typical American neighborhood, and let's say there's a parking shortage. Some people have driveways, some people don't, and I'm fortunate enough to have an ample-sized driveway, and my neighbors convinced the powers that be to change the local rules to say that anybody in the neighborhood can park in my driveway, but I get to determine how much that costs. The next thing we're going to have, right, of course, is a little conflict about is it a fair cost, and they'll be back to the powers that be, who will then be asked to set what the fair cost is, and of course I presume that would be the STB in our little corner of the world. Did you look into how the mechanics that would work? About I could anticipate a railroad not being happy about an involuntary imposition of something like terminal agreement. They have a busy terminal. They have trouble enough managing it with all their own trains. We know that service levels are not desirable even currently, and that most of the congestion and time, I shouldn't say most, but a great deal of congestion delays and other delays happen in and around terminals. You introduce an involuntary arrangement where other competitors get to come in and park cars and move trains and through that terminal, the owning railroad would presumably be pretty likely to come up with a pretty high price tag for that. We would then be asked, presumably in due course, to go and see whether that is reasonable. You'd have earnest, hardworking STB people flying around the country, kicking not the tires, I guess, but the rail wheels, and trying to figure out how inconvenient it might be, in fact, and interviewing people and coming up with some rational assessment. But do you see where I'm going? It's a little bit,
Yes.
there's a sort of a question mark there as to how that all plays out, whether that actually gets us a process with, frankly, less litigation, less cost to the parties when you look at how the cost of all that litigation. Did you give any thought to that in your analysis?
A lot of thought. And basically, first of all, one thing I think we say in the report is that the legislation that proposes these is silent on those types of details. And that's where, not to be trite about this, but the devil is in the details. And again, and that's why we say, for example, the incremental policies, for example, the reciprocal switching or terminal, it becomes less of a economic cost, well, obviously congestion and things like that and coordination between railroads, but the issues are bigger the bigger the access rights become, whether you're talking about bottlenecks or rates or trackage rights, and that's where the biggest fights would occur. But then how do you determine it? And again, my experience in telco says if you're the incumbent, you want to make sure you've sunk the investment and you've done it with the eye toward a reasonable expectation you can recover so you can keep investing. So you're going to have the incumbents' arguments on that side, and then the potential competitor is going to say, but the incremental cost of using that track is only this. So, why should we pay more than that? All we're doing is basically ensuring that the incumbent gets its fair return, which is not our job to do. So you do get into those fights, and they will become huge. And in fact, one way they tried to resolve this, and took a few, again, I alluded to Supreme Court cases in telecom, was when they opened the network, is something called TELRIC. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, total element long-run incremental cost, which I'm sure many people in this room will love to hear, was the cost of a hypothetically efficient firm offering its services, and what would the costs be? So you do get into those issues, and they are very thorny issues that could require a lot of, in my view, in my experience, a lot of litigation and resolution that I don't know if it's in anybody's best interest.
In your table on page 28, it looks like the bottleneck rate idea scores pretty poorly on your different ratings. Under shipper gains, least likely to produce shipper gains. Could you expand that? Because when one is first introduced to the bottleneck issue as a layman, one is naturally inclined to think of it in terms of shopping for an airfare rate. I want to fly from Washington, D.C. to Mobile, Alabama. I can look at a few airlines, figure out whether I want to go direct, nonstop, how flexible am I, and I can, and the airline doesn't shoot back an email to me saying, no, we think you're really going to Houston, but you're just being sneaky about telling us you're going to actually hang out in Mobile. We know you're really going to Houston, so we're going to quote you only rate. So when you first look at it, you think, boy, that's not a very customer-friendly concept to not allow a rate quote for the customer's requested journey. But then you say it would be least likely to actually result in shipper gains. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Okay, well, I'll start. And I think it gets back to the whole issue of how are these arrangements agreed to? Is it going to be a voluntary agreement between railroads? In which case, I think the perception is, or at least the analysis would say that based on their own economic interests, whether it is because of loss of economies of density or average length of haul or things like that, unless the railroads have already voluntarily agreed to these situations, if you made it mandatory, it's questionable how much voluntary resolution of these issues for all of these various combinations would be. So then you have to come up with some kind of formula to determine, well, how are we going to determine these costs? I mean, so then we get into how are you going to determine the formula? So I think you get into those types of issues once you consider that type of policy, because I think you'll get some voluntary response, but maybe where these things look like they may be needed the most, or where people are thinking they'll do the most good, may be the cases where you're not going to get the voluntary responses to that policy.
Yeah, I think we're just saying, particularly with respect to the bottleneck rates, is that sort of the economics of it aren't such that we expect that, since the voluntary arrangements aren't there now, mandating it, the rates that will come out will not be that favorable. So we just don't think things will actually change that much, that it won't be that effective. So I think our warning on that one is sort of don't get your hopes up if you do it. Is that? Yeah. I mean, not that it would cause great harm, but that it wouldn't change things that much, probably because of the economics.
Well, it gets back to a variation on access charges again, right? If we assume that this would be primarily an involuntary arrangement forced upon railroad carriers, changing the way they've done business, they would, of course, want to make sure their costs are recouped. And if a shipper says, I'd like my grain moved from Montana to Minneapolis, quote me a rate, but the real journey is back to Mobile, the next question is going to be, and by the way, thanks for the rate. That's a great rate, Montana to Minneapolis, St. Paul. But the railroad's going to say, well, let's talk about transfer charges, or you want it to be put on my competitor's train, and that's synchronized up, and we have to stop the unit train, take your car off, synchronize, bring our competitor in. Well, gee, that's going to be X cost, and we're right back to the STB, it seems to me, with complaints about the reasonableness of those costs. And so the initial rate might go down, but the total payments flowing from shippers to railroads may well not. Is that the type of thing you
those
came
are
across?
part of the economics that just don't make it work, that if you cut it sort of close to in half, you're losing some of the economies of the length of haul that you get. It's sort of and then also any transaction costs that go in there from having to change it from one to another, that adds to it versus end-to-end sort of hauling. So even if those rates come in at exactly what the cost is, it still may be more costly to have it split up than to have it not split up, and therefore it'll probably still end up the same way it is now. It's sort of the logic that we were following.
Now, turning a little bit to the agricultural sector, your report states that there were noticeably higher rates being borne by certain agricultural shippers. Could you expand on that and what some of the reasons for that might be, and what this board should be on the lookout for in that area? I mean, at first glance, it's probably not shocking that it may cost more to transfer bulk commodities from more remote, beautiful and productive, but remote locations in our country to the markets and ports and terminals that they need to go than it would be to move something shorter distances. But it's more than that, is what I'm hearing from your report. It's more than just the sheer distance factor.
Again, I refer back to that sort of the wheat maps that we put up there with the market structure variables, that what we're seeing there, that it is more than just the cost difference, because what the differences there are is sort of benchmarking wheat against itself, and those counties that have less competitive or fewer competitive alternatives pay a higher relative markup than the counties that don't for the same commodity. So now, again, whether that's fair or not fair is for somebody other than us to decide, but it is just that's what the evidence of it is. So to the extent that some of those commodities inherently lack competitive alternatives, that suggests that they should probably be toward the top of the list as far as watching for receiving some protection if protection is warranted on rates. So it's a lot of it is geography based. That it's just where the production takes place is not conducive to particularly the intermodal transportation, particularly closeness to water.
That's sort of mindful of the issue of micro-targeting gets a lot of attention in the political consulting world these days. Are you suggesting we should sort of micro-target and have maybe a series of or a file of zip codes? And if you send in a complaint to the STB and you've got that one of those zip codes, and I'm being serious. Actually,
Right,
we actually say, okay, this goes in stack A for priority. You know, this one, this could be, this is, you know, this very well, you know, may be an example of unreasonable pricing power being implemented here. Or how do we? Did you drill down to give us some help on how to address the reality that markets and communities that don't have diverse transportation options are likely paying higher rates? I think we kind of knew that before we hired you.
Yeah, well, you know, I hadn't really thought about the micro and targeting or the in those terms, or you know, using zip code, but I don't know. It may actually work, or county targeting, if you will. I believe what we have developed here is a methodology that allows you to use the data that you collect through the waybill sample data to do some fairly intensive analysis, but that will, in fact, by commodity, by county, identify those counties that are currently that have characteristics that are associated with higher markups, and therefore, yeah, you could sort of maybe take a complaint that came in from a county that on a commodity that it meets that requirement, like, yeah, this may be a serious issue that's coming in, and maybe you could be slightly more dismissive, relatively speaking, of ones that don't come from counties like that. So it's a thought, and we hadn't suggested that in our report, though.
Commissioner Buttrey, you have a question?
I just want to follow up on a question that Frank had earlier. Could you put up on the screen page 19 of the handout?
Which one is?
It's the one with the correlation of RBC with market factors chart. Yeah, that's it. The chart's confusing for me, not being an economist. It's entitled Correlation of RBC with Market Factors. Without going into great detail, I'm not picking on coal here by any chance, by any stretch of the imagination, but I just wanted to point out that the numbers that are under the first column there, starting with chemicals, going down the list to wheat, the revenue per ton mile, those numbers are not the average revenue per ton mile numbers in general that we have anyway here at the board. And I have made references to what these numbers are, and these are not the numbers we have. And I'm not saying your chart is wrong. I'm just saying it's a different. This number is different from just average revenue per ton mile. If you had, for instance, a chart in here that said there was just plain vanilla revenue per ton mile numbers on these commodities, just for example, coal would be the lowest, and on this chart it's the highest. So it's a little bit confusing unless you are an economist, unless you understand exactly what this chart is supposed to do. But if you just looked at these numbers, you would say,
Yeah,
it would take your breath. It would take my breath away when I looked at this chart and see the numbers there, because they're so different from what the just average revenue per ton mile numbers really are based on the waybill sample.
Right. This is the second time this very column's come up in this discussion here, and I
Well,
think
it was bothering Frank, and
right,
it was bothering me.
I
And
think that reflects that we have a bad presentation of the table. This is a correlation coefficient that's presented here, and we should make
And
that
you can
clear.
read that, but it's just not clear from, when you look down
Right.
and say, well.
So that's our fault
Yeah,
for not making it
and
clear.
the reason I bring it up is not to point out that you've got a confusing chart. That's not my point. My point is that someone looking at this would say, look at this, say, oh my goodness, coal is the highest, when in fact, the average average revenue per ton mile basis, it is the lowest. I'm not saying I know what it is. Everybody up here knows what it is. I'm not sure, probably not able to say what it is, but we know what it is, and it's not 61.
What makes it confusing too is those numbers in that column are so different from the rest. The other ones are all very small, and those are relatively larger.
Right.
So maybe you don't think it's also a correlation coefficient. So.
Right.
But it is.
It is.
Clearly is.
No, I can see the confusion.
That's all I had, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe the risk of taxing everyone's patience, maybe just if you could maybe take another stab at going through the table on page 19 just to make sure we understand it. The left-hand column, the revenue per ton mile, the decimal point numbers there indicate who's getting, if you looked at this, who seems to be paying less per ton mile, who seems to be paying the most, or if that's not if that's confusing to look at, what should we be looking at?
It may be the way of thinking about this. If you take a look at the top line of that chart where it says correlation coefficient with RVC ratio, every one of those columns says, let's take the RVC ratio for that commodity and let's correlate it with these various columns represented by revenue per ton mile, distance to water, origin, etc. So all of these are the correlation coefficients for those commodities. For like coal's revenue per ton mile is correlated with the RVC ratios for coal at 0.61, which is actually the highest correlation coefficient among the commodities and their revenue per ton mile.
Which means is simply that if it was 1, it would be perfectly correlated, and if it was 0, it'd be perfectly uncorrelated.
So in fact, each thing in the headings in the top is an alternative measure of how competitive or captive or non-competitive a market is, and we're saying how well does the sort of standard that we're using now, the RVC ratio, how do these things relate to each other? And so if they were, in fact, perfect substitute measures of captivity, that would be a perfect correlation. You would have 1. The fact that they're all very close to 0, and we should have put Pearson coefficients in there to tell you the significance, but we didn't. The fact that they're very close to 0 says, our measure, our theoretical measure over here of what's happening in competitive competition-wise isn't at all moving with the measure that you're forced by statute to use, what's happening competition-wise. That's the message of this table.
Your report did a pretty thorough job of discussing and assessing one of the major realities of working in the rail industry as we understand it, which is just costs. Costs can go down or stay flat or go up, and in recent years your study seems to indicate that rising input costs, things like steel and fuel presumably, played a large role in the rate increases that the rail industry implemented. Did I get that correct? First of all, that's that overview. Did I fairly characterize that? Because my next question is: we now see some of those inputs dropping, fuel, steel, etc. What would be your projection on rates if those trends were to continue for a couple of years? And then, what should we be expecting as regulators looking at rates? Should we be looking for rates to decline?
What we would expect to see if we extended the cost function estimation and analysis is that as fuel prices come down, as other prices come down, if they do come down, that the variable cost and the marginal cost should come down. Now, the real question is, will the revenue per ton mile follow it downward, or will it stay where it's at? To the extent that the revenue per ton mile stays, then that's an increase in market power, and that learner index will move up. So that's what's to watch. So, I mean, I can tell you what will happen to cost. I don't know what will happen to the rates.
Thank you. Colleagues, any additional questions?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Seeing and hearing none, we will bring this hearing to close momentarily. I do have a quick housekeeping closing statement to make, just to make sure we get a couple of pieces of information out. First of all, I want to thank our partners at the Christensen group here, Drs. Eakin and Meitzen, for their excellent report and their testimony today. I note that the board has asked Christensen to provide ongoing research assistance on the issue of capacity, an issue that has been a focus of the board's attention for quite some time. I look forward to seeing the results of that work we're projecting by the end of February 2009. I also note that in the course of conducting the study, Christensen met with a number of stakeholder groups to obtain their input and perspective. Now that the study has concluded, the board would like its stakeholders to have the opportunity to comment on the study's findings and methodologies. We will be issuing a decision today providing for a 45-day public comment period on this study, and I hope all interested parties will take this opportunity to express their views, and we look forward to seeing that. And with that, I'd like to thank Christensen Associates again, and my colleagues, and also our staff at the STB for helping administer this contract and also prepare for this public meeting. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.